The day the United States almost vanished without a war. At 9:17 a.m. on a quiet spring morning, the United States of America ceased to exist. Not in flames, not under foreign invasion, not by rebellion, but by paperwork. No cannon fired, no city burned, no declaration was read aloud to the public. And yet, for several terrifying hours, there were two United States, each claiming to be the real one. One had the Constitution, the other had the Army. Most Americans alive today have never heard this story, not in school, not in documentaries, not in patriotic speeches, because admitting how close the American system came to total legal collapse would mean admitting something far more disturbing, that the survival of the United States has often depended not on law, but on men willing to break it. The room where America held its breath. Washington City in the mid-19th century was not the marble capital tourists imagine today. It was muddy, unfinished, and tense. The streets were half-paved, the air smelled of wet wood and coal smoke, and rumors traveled faster than horses. Inside the Capitol, men whispered. Outside it, soldiers waited. The country was splitting, not just North versus South, but law versus force, paper versus power. And at the center of it all stood a tall, awkward lawyer from Illinois who never expected to hold the fate of a continent in his hands. Abraham Lincoln did not look like a man about to break the American system, but history rarely warns you when it's about to happen. An election that didn't end an argument. The election of 1860 is often taught as a clean turning point. Lincoln wins, the South secedes, the Civil War begins. That version is comforting. It makes everything seem inevitable. The truth was far messier and far more dangerous. Lincoln won the presidency without winning the South at all. In 10 southern states, his name didn't even appear on the ballot. Entire regions of the country had elected a president they never voted for, never recognized, and never accepted. In modern terms, imagine a president elected today with 0 votes from half the country, and then being told to rule it anyway. The Constitution said he could. Politics said he shouldn't. History waited to see what he would do. Before the war, there was the collapse. Long before the first shot at Fort Sumter, the United States was already unraveling. Federal judges refused to enforce laws. State militias ignored presidential authority. Congress threatened itself with violence. One senator was nearly beaten to death with a cane on the Senate floor. This was not a stable republic drifting toward conflict. It was a system already cracking under its own contradictions. Slavery was the issue everyone talked about. Power was the issue no one admitted. The oath that almost destroyed the Union. On March 4, 1861, Lincoln stood on the steps of the Capitol to take the presidential oath. The Bible was open. The crowd was silent. The words were familiar. But hidden in that simple ceremony was a legal time bomb. Because at that exact moment, the United States did not clearly exist as a single legal entity. 7 states had already declared themselves out. They had formed a rival government. They had seized federal property. They had an army. And the Constitution, shockingly, said almost nothing about what to do next. No exit clause, no enforcement mechanism, no clear authority. Just silence. When Lincoln placed his hand on the Bible, he swore to preserve a union that might already have been gone. 2 governments, 1 name. Within weeks, Americans were being arrested without trial. Newspapers were shut down by soldiers. A sitting Chief Justice of the Supreme Court openly declared the president's actions illegal and was ignored. This was not constitutional order. This was emergency rule, and it would set precedents that still haunt the United States today. The question no one wanted to answer. Was Abraham Lincoln saving the Constitution or destroying it to save the country? Because if the law cannot survive a crisis, what is it really worth? That question would follow Lincoln to his grave and beyond it. The Chief Justice who said no. Roger B. Taney was not a revolutionary. He was old, frail, deeply conservative, and had spent his entire life believing in the supremacy of law over men. He had written one of the most infamous Supreme Court decisions in American history, Dred Scott versus Sandford, which declared that Black Americans could never be citizens. Taney believed in the Constitution as written, and that belief would put him on a collision course with Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus, the ancient legal protection against imprisonment without trial, Taney was horrified. The Constitution allowed suspension only in cases of rebellion or invasion, and even then, only Congress had that power. Lincoln did it anyway. When a Maryland secessionist named John Merryman was arrested by the military and held without charge, Taney intervened. He ordered Merryman released. The military ignored him. So Taney did something no Chief Justice had ever done before. He declared publicly that the President of the United States was acting illegally. The country now had a constitutional crisis layered on top of a national one. The Supreme Court said one thing, the President did another, the Army followed the President, and nothing happened to stop it. That silence was louder than any cannon. The precedent that terrified the founders. The Founding Fathers had feared exactly this scenario. A charismatic leader, a national emergency, a population willing to trade liberty for security. They had written checks and balances to prevent it, but they had never imagined a situation where the system itself would freeze, unable to act quickly enough to save itself. Congress wasn't in session. Courts had no enforcement power. States were choosing sides. Lincoln looked at the chaos and made a decision that would define modern America. Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated? In other words, was it better to break the law or let the country die legally? Arresting a state without declaring war. Maryland was the most dangerous place in America in 1861. If it seceded, Washington, D.C. would be surrounded by hostile territory. The capital itself could fall without a single battle. So Lincoln acted first. He arrested state legislatures before they could vote. He stationed troops at polling places. He shut down newspapers critical of the government. No declaration of martial law, no congressional authorization, just force. Maryland never officially left the Union, not because its people didn't want to, but because they were never allowed to decide. This was not how a constitutional republic was supposed to work, but it worked. The Union that survived by breaking its own rules. By the summer of 1861, the question was no longer legal, it was practical. Could the Union survive long enough for the law to catch up? Lincoln knew history would judge him harshly if he lost, so he made sure there would be a history to judge him at all. The Civil War would kill more Americans than any conflict before or since, but before it killed bodies, it nearly killed the idea of limited government, and the scar never fully healed. The America that emerged was not the same. When the war ended, the Union survived, but it was transformed. The federal government was stronger, states were weaker, presidential power expanded permanently. The Constitution bent, and once bent, it never fully straightened again. Every emergency power claimed afterward, from world wars to surveillance states to executive orders, could trace its lineage back to Lincoln's decisions in 1861. This was the price of survival. The story history softened. School books would later paint Lincoln as a flawless savior. Monuments would cast him in marble. But the truth is more unsettling and more human. He gambled, he broke rules, he ignored courts, he silenced critics, and he saved the United States. Whether that makes him a hero or a warning depends on what you believe a republic is supposed to be. But this was only the beginning. Because the Civil War did not end America's constitutional experiments. It taught future leaders something far more dangerous, that in moments of fear, Americans would accept almost anything, as long as it was framed as survival. And that lesson would be used again, and again, and again. How emergency powers became permanent, from Lincoln to the secret state. When the guns finally went silent in 1865, Americans told themselves a comforting story, that the war had been an exception, that extraordinary powers were temporary, that once peace returned, the Constitution would snap back into place. It never did. What Abraham Lincoln had proven, without ever saying it out loud, was something far more powerful than victory, that in America, emergency powers did not disappear after the emergency ended. They simply waited for the next crisis. The quiet after the storm. The Civil War ended with parades, flags, and speeches about unity. But behind the celebrations, something subtle was happening. The federal government did not shrink back to its pre-war size. The presidency did not surrender the powers it had claimed. The military did not return to being a distant institution. Washington had tasted control, and it did not forget the flavor. Reconstruction was not just about rebuilding the South, it was about redefining who truly ruled America. For the first time, federal troops occupied states not as enemies, but as overseers. Voting rules were rewritten, state governments were dissolved and rebuilt, civil rights were enforced at gunpoint. Some of it was necessary. Some of it was just power learning it could act without permission. The emergency that never officially ended. The Constitution never says when an emergency ends. There is no legal ceremony, no reset button, no return to normal clause. That ambiguity would become one of the most exploited weaknesses in American law. Each generation inherited the last generation's exceptions and added a few more of its own. The question was no longer, can the government do this? It became, has the government already done this before? And the answer, more often than not, was yes. The first modern surveillance state. By the late 19th century, America had expanded west, industrialized, and grown wealthy. It had also grown nervous. Immigrants arrived by the millions. Labor movements spread. Anarchists talked openly about killing presidents. And in 1901, one of them succeeded. When President William McKinley was assassinated, fear flooded Washington. Not fear of invasion, fear of ideas. Ideas could not be shot at. Ideas required watching. So the federal government did something new. It began to monitor its own people, quietly, informally, without oversight. This was not yet a law, it was a habit. The birth of an invisible police force. In 1908, without public debate or constitutional amendment, the United States created a small investigative unit inside the Department of Justice. It had no official name at first, no clear limits, no public accountability. Later, it would be called the Federal Bureau of Investigation. At the time, it was sold as a temporary solution to a temporary problem. It never stopped growing. War makes everything legal. World War I did not just send American soldiers overseas, it brought the battlefield home. Under the Espionage Act of 1917, Americans were arrested for criticizing the war. Newspapers were censored, speeches were criminalized, dissent became suspicion. The Supreme Court upheld it all. The logic was simple and devastating. In wartime, speech itself can be a weapon. That reasoning would survive long after the war ended. The man who perfected control. No one understood this better than J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover believed in order the way others believed in God. He kept files. He collected secrets. He never forgot a name. Under his leadership, the FBI became something unprecedented, a permanent internal security apparatus in a country that claimed to fear such things. Civil rights leaders were watched, politicians were monitored, journalists were cataloged. Officially, this was to protect democracy. Unofficially, it protected those who already held power. The Cold War. Fear goes nuclear. Then came the Cold War. This time, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once. Communism was not a country, it was an ideology, and ideologies could infect anyone. Teachers, actors, scientists, neighbors. Loyalty oaths were demanded, careers were destroyed, lives were quietly erased. Again, it was all justified as temporary. Again, it became permanent. The agency that wasn't supposed to exist like this. In 1947, the United States created the Central Intelligence Agency. It was not supposed to spy on Americans. It was not supposed to manipulate governments. It was not supposed to operate in secrecy without oversight. But emergencies have a way of rewriting mission statements. Coups were organized. Elections were influenced. Information was classified not for safety, but for control. And the American public was told very little. Because secrecy, once normalized, does not feel like tyranny. It feels like protection. The question that would not go away. Every generation faced the same dilemma in a new costume. If the government already has the power and claims it needs the power, who is brave enough to take it away? The answer was almost always no one. A pattern, not an accident. From Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus to Hoover's surveillance files to Cold War blacklists, this was not a series of mistakes, it was a pattern. A nation built to fear centralized power slowly learned to live with it as long as it arrived wrapped in fear. And then came the moment that changed everything again. On a clear September morning, decades later, the United States would face a shock so profound that every old emergency power would feel suddenly insufficient. New ones would be demanded and given. But that is the next chapter.
The day fear became policy. How America rewrote itself after 9/11. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the United States lost nearly 3,000 lives. By nightfall, it lost something else too, something far harder to count: its old assumptions. The attacks did not just destroy buildings, they collapsed decades of legal restraint in a single day. And most Americans welcomed it. The hours when nothing made sense. For hours after the towers fell, no one knew who was in charge. Airspace was closed. Fighter jets scrambled without clear orders. Government officials were moved to undisclosed locations. The continuity of government plan, designed during the Cold War for nuclear annihilation, was quietly activated. Few citizens realized what that meant. Emergency authority was no longer theoretical. It was operational. The question that no one debated. Within days, Washington faced a choice that would define the century. Should the United States remain a country governed by pre-crisis laws or become a country governed by post-crisis fear? There was no real debate. Congress moved with unprecedented speed, not to limit power, but to grant it. The Patriot Act, a law no one read. The USA Patriot Act was introduced, debated, and passed in weeks. Hundreds of pages, sweeping surveillance authority, vague definitions of terrorism. Many lawmakers admitted later they had not read it. They did not need to. The title alone framed opposition as betrayal. To vote no was to look weak. To ask questions was to seem suspicious. Fear had become legislative leverage. Watching everyone just in case. Under the new rules, the government could collect phone metadata without warrants, monitor emails, access financial records, delay or deny trials, all legally. The justification was always the same. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. It was a comforting lie. The return of indefinite detention. Guantanamo Bay was chosen for a reason. It was outside the continental United States, outside ordinary courts, outside constitutional clarity. Men were held for years without charges. Some were innocent, some were not. The system did not care, because the goal was not justice, it was control under uncertainty. Torture renamed techniques. Long recognized as torture were rebranded, enhanced interrogation. Legal memos were written to justify the unjustifiable. Pain was quantified, suffering was analyzed, morality was outsourced to lawyers. All of it classified, all of it approved, and all of it defended as temporary. The surveillance state goes digital. What Hoover had done with filing cabinets, the modern state now did with servers. Data became the new weapon. Not targeted suspicion, but total collection. The logic shifted completely. Don't investigate suspects, collect everything, then search backward. This was not policing. This was pre-crime. The whistleblowers who broke the silence. Years later, when documents leaked, Americans were shocked, not because the programs existed, but because they were larger than anyone imagined. Global surveillance, allies monitored, citizens tracked. The government insisted it was legal, and it was because it had made itself so. Normalizing the unthinkable. Airports became checkpoints, cameras multiplied, privacy became conditional. Children grew up thinking this was normal because emergencies that last long enough stop feeling like emergencies. They become background noise. The same old argument reused. Every challenge met the same response. This is not the time. Not the time to debate. Not the time to limit power. Not the time to worry about abuse. There was always another threat. There always would be. What Lincoln would have recognized. Abraham Lincoln had asked whether breaking one law was acceptable to save the nation. 2 centuries later, the question had expanded. How many laws could be bent before the idea of limits disappeared entirely? No one answered it, because answering it would require giving something up. The republic that learned to live with fear. America did not become a dictatorship. Something more subtle happened. It became a nation permanently prepared for emergency. And a nation in permanent emergency does not roll power back. It accumulates it, quietly, legally, endlessly. And still, the story was not over, because the next challenge would not come from terrorists or foreign states. It would come from within, from doubt, from division, from the question of whether Americans even agreed on what was real. And that would be the most dangerous crisis yet.
When truth collapsed, media, misinformation, and the fracturing of America. There was a time when Americans argued about ideas. By the early 21st century, they were arguing about reality itself. That change did not happen overnight. It was engineered slowly, unintentionally, and then exploited deliberately. And once truth fractured, power no longer needed force, it needed confusion. When everyone watched the same world. For most of the 20th century, Americans lived inside a shared information space. 3 television networks, a handful of national newspapers, a common set of facts, even when opinions differed. This was not perfect. Bias existed, voices were excluded. But reality was at least negotiable. You could argue what something meant because you agreed that it happened. That consensus would not survive technology. The Internet's original promise. The Internet was supposed to democratize knowledge. Anyone could publish. Anyone could speak. Gatekeepers would disappear. At first, it felt like freedom, but systems that remove gates also remove filters, and into that vacuum rushed everything. Truth, lies, half-truths, manufactured outrage. All equal, all competing, all optimized for attention. The algorithm that replaced the editor. Editors once decided what mattered. Algorithms decided what spread. And algorithms did not care about truth. They cared about engagement. Anger traveled faster than nuance. Fear outperformed context. Outrage beat accuracy every time. Slow journalism lost to instant reaction. Reality became optional. News as identity. Media outlets stopped competing over facts. They competed over loyalty. Not what happened, but who you were if you believed it. Audiences fragmented into information tribes, each with its own heroes, its own villains, its own version of America. Watching the wrong channel became suspicious. Reading the wrong source became betrayal. The profit in division. Division was not a side effect. It was profitable. Outrage kept people scrolling. Fear kept them watching. Confirmation kept them loyal. The more divided the audience, the more predictable their behavior. Predictability is power. Politics learned the lesson. Politicians noticed. They stopped trying to persuade everyone. They focused on energizing their side and discrediting all others. Compromise became weakness. Complexity became danger. Simple stories won, even when they were false. The death of the shared timeline. Social media did something unprecedented. It broke time. Two people could live in the same country, watch the same event, and receive entirely different explanations instantly. There was no delay for reflection, no pause for verification. Emotion arrived first. Truth arrived late, if at all. From skepticism to cynicism. Healthy skepticism asks questions. Cynicism rejects answers. As trust collapsed, Americans stopped asking who is right. They asked who benefits. Every institution became suspect. Courts, elections, science, journalism. If nothing is trustworthy, everything is manipulatable. When facts became weapons. Information was no longer about understanding, it was about winning. Selective facts were amplified, contradictory evidence was dismissed, corrections were ignored. Being wrong stopped being embarrassing, it became strategic. The feedback loop of fear. Fear fueled clicks, clicks fueled coverage, coverage fueled fear. The system fed on itself. Calm voices were drowned out. Extreme narratives dominated. Moderation vanished. Foreign hands opened doors. Adversaries did not need to invade. They watched, they learned, and they intervened quietly, amplifying division, encouraging mistrust, exploiting open platforms. No tanks, no bombs, just posts. The Republic without a common story. A nation is not just laws and borders, it is a shared story about what is real. When that story fractures, power flows to those who can define reality, or at least confuse it. America entered a new phase, not of censorship, but of informational overload. Not silence, but noise. The old safeguards fail again. The founders had imagined tyranny through control of speech. They had not imagined drowning speech in endless contradiction. You cannot debate your way out of chaos when no one agrees on the ground beneath the argument. A crisis without a single villain. There was no dictator, no single conspiracy, just incentives, technology, fear, and a population slowly losing the ability to tell signal from noise. The stage is set. By the time the next shock arrived,
The legal system was stretched, the public was divided, and truth itself was exhausted. All that remained was a final test. What happens when a democracy cannot agree on whether its own rules were followed? That question would be answered soon, and the answer would shake the system harder than any foreign attack.